Thanks everybody for showing up for my master class on cybersecurity. Roger Grimes teaches password best practices. Again, I'm Roger Grimes. You've not met me before. I've been doing computer security for 34 years. I've written 13 books and over 1,200 magazine articles. My first book was an ebook on password security. So it's actually not in this list. These are the other 12 books. I don't have the cover of my first ebook, but I did that for, it was like called Windows or Windows.net magazine, but it was on passwords. So I've been doing password and password security for a long, long time. I work for KnowBe4. We're the world's largest integrated security awareness training and simulated phishing platform vendor. We try to help people not to be socially engineered or phished, and that's important because that's the way that most people get hacked, is social engineering and phishing. That's the way that most people lose their passwords, social engineering and phishing. So it's a really important thing to try to prevent. Today's agenda is to talk about the different types of password attacks and defenses, and then really what your password policy should be to stop all of those attacks. That's what it's all about. It's everything I know. I've got like 80 slides, even a short pre-recorded demo in here to do over the next 60 minutes. So I'm going to be moving along. But to cut right to the chase, this is my password policy that I'm going to come back to at the end again. And then I'm going to tell you why this is our password policy, or my recommended password policy. You need to use multi-factor authentication wherever you can to protect valuable data and systems. So use, hopefully, phishing-resistant MFA wherever you can, but you're not going to be able to use MFA everywhere, so you're going to have to use passwords, and your passwords should be long and complex. And really, we kind of recommend that you use a password manager, and that's because a 12-character, fully random, perfectly random password defeats all known password guessing cracking attacks. If you make the password out of your head, it has to be 20 characters or longer. But that's my password policy. This is where we're going to end up at the end of the conversation. Again, you should use MFA where you can, and where you can't, you need to use strong and different passwords that are different for every website and service. Either 12 characters perfectly random or longer, or 20 characters if made up out of your head. And if those if it sounds crazy that I'm recommending that you use a 20-character password, I'm going to tell you why in this talk. There's a lot of problems with passwords. I think we all know about it, that passwords can be easily stolen and bypassed. But really the biggest problem is that the average person has to log on to over 170 different websites and services, but they only have 3 to 19 passwords, which means there's a lot of reuse. So that if one of those websites gets compromised, or if a hacker compromises one and two and sees that there's a pattern to the passwords, they can use that to more easily compromise you and other websites. But part of the problem, you'll hear people say, well, passwords are going away. Passwords are going to be gone. We're going to be in this passwordless society. I've been hearing that since the early 1990s, that passwords are going away. They still haven't. They'll probably be with us for a decade or longer. And the biggest reason is that, if you were to add up all the alternatives to passwords, so MFA and passwordless and biometrics and all this stuff, they probably won't work on 2% of the world's websites and services. But you know what does work on 98% of the world's websites and services? Logon name and password. So for that reason, we all have lots and lots of passwords today. And there's even all kinds of passwords, to protect our wireless networks, and computers use passwords, and there are passwords all around us. Not only do we have more than ever, but even the computers and devices and networks that we use have passwords. So I don't think passwords are going anywhere anytime soon. And so I think this is a really good course that you're hearing today. We're going to start off by talking about the different types of password attacks and defenses, and then get back to the password policy recommendations. But the biggest problem with passwords is that they can be stolen or bypassed. In general, the password attacks can be categorized as password theft, where somebody or something takes your password guessing, where they guess at your password successfully, or password hash theft and cracking, which we'll cover and talk a lot about. That is really, password hash theft and cracking is really the reason your password has to be 12 characters fully random, or 20 characters or longer if coming out of your head. And also sometimes people, they don't care about your password. They can just reset it. They can fool the system that you're logging into. They can tell the system, oh, I forgot my password and I want to reset it, and somehow reset it or bypass it. We'll talk about all of those sorts of attacks over the next hour. Stealing your password is the most popular way that your password is attacked. It can be attacked many different ways. I have them listed here. I'm going to go over them individually now. But the most common way that an attacker might get your password is that you get some type of social engineering message or email that tricks you or victims into providing a password. They think that they're logging on to a legitimate website, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, their company website or whatever. But really all it was a fake lookalike website with a fake lookalike link, or sometimes the links don't look anything alike. And the person just gets tricked into providing their logon name and password. That is by far the most common way that people's passwords get compromised. Over 50% of all social engineering and email phishing attacks, and SMS attacks, SMS text message attacks involve trying to trick you out of your legitimate login name and password. It also can be stolen by malware. These days, most malware, computer worms or Trojans, or whatever, if they get on your device, most of them will look around for passwords and steal them. A really common password stealing Trojan is known as TrickBot. And I've kind of got I've got a recount of passwords that were stolen by TrickBot on one network. And you can see that they're not only stealing company passwords, but they're stealing passwords where people, they're stealing people's, passwords they'd use to go to their banking websites, their healthcare portals, shipping and postage accounts, Amazon, Facebook, LinkedIn, Microsoft, Twitter. If malware gets on your computer, any password stored there, any password you type in, why that malware is on your endpoint is possibly going to be stolen and uploaded to hackers. It is a really, really common way that passwords are stolen today, especially if you store them in your browser. A lot of people, the browser will go, hey, do you want me to store this password so you can log on more quickly next time? If you say yes and it gets stored in your browser, certainly in the malware like TrickBot looks for those sort of browser stored passwords. Sometimes it's hackers that get in on the endpoint. There's lots of hacking tools out there today. I list 2 or 3 here that if they get on your computer or if they get on your network, they can steal your password. Empire PowerShell Toolkit's been around for about a decade. Mimikatz has probably been around for going on 2 decades. And there's another common tool called Wince that people use. But again, if hackers get on your endpoint or your network, they can steal your passwords using. There's another one is Metasploit is a really common one. Metasploit, these can be used legitimately or illegitimately. Metasploit is a commercial vendor that tries to sell their Metasploit framework software, to good guy hackers, but they can be used by bad guy hackers to steal your passwords as well. If the attacker can eavesdrop on your network or do what's called man-in-the-middle attacks, they can steal your password. There's literally dozens to hundreds of tools out there. Responder is one. I'm actually going to show you a demo in a little while where our chief hacking officer, Kevin Mitnick, is going to use a really short demo, show you how the software called Responder, it's a free software that anybody can download, but that can steal your password. He can actually send you an email, and all you do is open that email or click on a link in that email, and it steals your password hash, which they then guess at or crack. So again, many times attackers can, if they can get into a network eavesdropping scenario, a man-in-the-middle attack, they can capture passwords going by on the wire, as we say. Another common way that passwords are stolen is developers many times accidentally upload their code to public repositories like GitHub. If you don't know about GitHub, GitHub is a really popular place where you can upload your code as you develop it to. And unfortunately, developers many times hard code, put in passwords on their development code, and they forget this and they upload it to GitHub. And then GitHub many times allows other people to view the code. And you can see from these news reports, there's this public test where a CEO of a company intentionally uploaded some code that had login information in it. And within 34 minutes, there was an attacker trying to compromise his fake honeypot system with that login information. 34 minutes after he uploaded it to GitHub, somebody was trying to exploit it. And there, here's another link was saying that 85% of leaks occur on developers' personal repositories like GitHub. But, just again, very common type of thing. And it's been that way for a long, long time, is that developers and other people forget to remove their passwords when they upload their code to a development site. Sometimes it's, physical examples. I've walked into, as an example, to, hotels and seen the hotel login name and password for the hotel clerks, how they get on the system to be, it's on a board behind them. I've seen commercials where reporters are interviewing politicians or politician staff. And again, right in the background, you can see the logon name and password. I've seen congressmen where they're on C-SPAN and you can see the congressman typing on their phone and you can actually read their password. Or I remember one year Kanye West was trying, he was filmed opening up his cell phone and you could see that his password for his cell phone was like 77777, and like, okay, the reason why it was that way is an assistant probably set up his cell phone, knew that Kanye didn't want to have a really complex password to open up his phone and figured Kanye would change it or something. But, now on live TV, everybody knew Kanye's password for his cell phone was 7777. That picture I have on the screen there was actually a login name and password. The U was for user to log into a laptop that was in a government building. It was in a public meeting space in a government building, so anybody in the public could be there. And this laptop was the presentation laptop that anybody could use to do presenting. But I was kind of shocked that it had the login name and password. And I said to the IT person there, putting your password, username and password on a Post-it note is, like a joke. Like that's what we talk about that people always do is put their passwords on Post-it notes. I said, please tell me that this computer isn't connected to your real network. And he said, well, think that or tell it to yourself if it makes you feel better. So it's amazing how many times you can just see passwords out in the open. But because of all of this, your password, my password is everywhere. If you've been on the internet probably longer than 10 years, you've probably had a password compromised somewhere. And again, a lot of times it isn't because of anything you do, or like me, I've had my passwords knowingly compromised 13 times now, and not because of anything I did, but because the websites I belong to, like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Adobe and TechSmith, they got compromised, and that led to my passwords being compromised. But there are literally tens of billions of login names and passwords all over the internet. We call them dump sets. Password dump sets. Just one password dump set had nearly 3 billion logon names, just one set that you could go to, and that was from 2019. But now today, there's been several larger dump sets that have tens of billions of login names and passwords. And again, if you've been on the internet 10 years or longer, there's a good chance that your login name and password is in there. And, years ago, I used to think, well, I'll do a different password for every website, but I'll do it with a pattern. Like I'll use the password frog. Well, if I went to Facebook, I'd make my password frog FB. If I went to Twitter, it was frog, TW. If it was Instagram, it was frog I or something like that. And I thought I was being really, smart, different password for every website. But as my passwords began to be compromised on those websites, you could see the pattern. All of a sudden out there in public dump sites was my password saying frog FB and frog I and frog TW. You don't have to be a newer genius to say Roger likes using this word frog, and I just have to change the last two letters. So I ended up realizing that using a pattern in my password so I wouldn't have to write them down was not a good idea. And there's really, hackers have tools like Recon NG. There's dozens to hundreds of tools that help hackers find these stolen passwords. With Recon NG, it's pre-configured to connect to many of these password dump websites. And all you have to do, and again, this is free software you can download, Recon NG, is type in the domain name of the password you're looking for, like noble4.com or rogergrimes.com or whatever, and then you can run reconnaissance modules that will look to see, is Roger's emails or is Roger's login names in a leak dump? So look up the leak, look up the dump, pull back the domain creds. So literally, if an attacker wants to find out every login name and password that's ever been stolen from your company, they can put in your company's domain name, again, like noble4.com, and hit and tell it to go find every login name and password out of any of the tens of billions of already leaked public logon names and passwords out there, and bring them back in one convenient list for the hacker to use. And again, if they, a lot of times they'll get passwords that employees have used on Twitter and Facebook and Amazon, and see if they work on that victim's employee company website, and oftentimes they do. There are literally hundreds of databases with your email address and password for free or for sale on the internet and the dark web. If your password has been compromised before, there are literally all kinds of gangs that go around trying to steal people's passwords. Like in this particular news report I have here from 2021, this one guy said that just one hacking gang would just try to log on to people's email accounts using different email account names and passwords. They would attempt this one criminal group would try between 5 to 10 million email authentication attempts daily, and they'd come away with 50 to 100,000 compromised logon names and passwords. And these are real active login names and passwords. So every day, just one group was getting 50,000 to 100,000 passwords. Microsoft in the December 2020 post said 1 out of every 250 of their corporate accounts are compromised each month. Each month, and they had over 240 million active users. That's a lot of compromised accounts. If you want to find out if your password or your company's passwords have been compromised, there's lots of password testing tools out there that look that up for you. We have one that we recommend. Probably the most popular site is Have I Been Pwned, haveibeenpwned.com, run by Troy Hunt, who does work for Microsoft or did work for Microsoft. But you can see I put in like my work account, rogerg@noble4.com, and it's like, good news, it's not been stolen. I put in my personal email address on the other side, and you see it says it has been found on 10 breached sites. And so these are not things I did to get my password compromised. This is other websites that I trusted, like adobe.com. I bought Adobe Reader software, and when they told me to register, and I put in a login name and password, and Twitter and Instagram and TechSmith, when I bought some software from them, they got compromised. And so if I'm using a shared password or a password with a pattern, lo and behold, there's 10 of my passwords out there. Today, I think it's up to 13. And they will show you, back in the olden days, I was using a password that kind of had a pattern in it. Instead of using Have I Been Pwned on every employee in your company, I actually recommend that you download and use KnowBe4's password exposure test tool. You can go to that link at the bottom of your page and download this tool, but you can then import your employee login list, and it will go out on the internet and the dark web and stuff and tell you how many login names and or passwords are out there. And if you find, it will not reveal any of your data, it will not put any of your passwords out there. It doesn't upload any of your passwords to us, but it will tell you which accounts are vulnerable and which ones are using weak passwords and that sort of stuff. That's a really good tool to download and use. Sometimes the attackers will just try to guess at your password. They have to be able to find some type of online logon prompt where they can put in your login name and password. Many times the maximum number of times they can guess is limited by account lockout. A lot of sites, if you go to it and you guess the wrong password too many times, let's say 6 times in 15 minutes, it will lock that account out, either permanently till someone unlocks it, or at least for a certain period of time, 30 minutes, an hour, a day, or whatever. But hackers will try to find online login prompts that don't have account lockout or what's called rate throttling. And if so, they can guess, like depending on the instance, they can guess up to 100 times per minute, sometimes even faster per instance. I know of hackers that have guessed over 100,000 times a day. So you should always enable account lockout or what's called rate throttling on all your login prompts that you're able to control. But this guessing, in order for it to work, the attacker has to find an online logon prompt to guess against. There's a couple different ways that they can try to guess against it. Brute force guessing is just where they just try every possible guess, like A, B, ABC, that sort of stuff. Most attackers today use what's called a dictionary attack, which is they know that people like to use words. in their passwords, like frog. And so they will start out with a word, and then they'll start to try to figure out human logic to add. Like, most people think they have a complex password that have what they think is a complex password is usually a password with an uppercase. The first letter of their password is uppercase. It's usually a consonant, and it's usually followed by the rest of the letters or lowercase, including the next letter in that password is usually a vowel, A, E, I, O, or U. And if the person has a number, it's usually a 1 or a 2, and it's at the end. Almost at least 90% of quote unquote complex passwords fit that format I just shared with you, which is uppercase consonant followed by a lowercase vowel with a number 1 or 2 at the end. And so attackers, instead of doing brute force, they'll just kind of use some human logic about how people like to make their passwords. And there's a lot of the top 100 most common passwords have been the top 100 most common passwords, like password and QWERTY and stuff like that, have been the most popular passwords for decades now. So again, guessing at it really only works if you have a weak password or when guessing is allowed to be unlimited. But that certainly works. A lot of people do have weak passwords, like password and password 2 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and Michael and baseball and things like that. You can actually go on the internet, and there's lots of lists of the top 10, top 25, top 25, top 100 most common passwords. If you look at them, they actually don't change that much over time. Like QWERTY's in there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is in there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 is in there, baseball's in there, let me in is in there. I mean, I used to track passwords all the time in these public password dump lists, and I got bored with it because I realized that the most common passwords are still the most common passwords, 3 decades later. So, and what's wild is even if you have a password policy that requires complexity, it's really weird how these weak passwords sometimes will just sneak on in. Somehow somebody's account gets reset, someone puts in a password, and boom, the attacker is in. 75% of organizations have at least one user with a password that is on a list of the 1,000 most common passwords. That's a pretty shocking stat there. And remember, most complex passwords really aren't that complex. The example of the longest password guess that I know of is Welcome 2020. That's a Dutch word, Welcome 2020. This municipality, Dutch municipality city, used that password across one of their admin accounts. But the reason why the hackers were able to guess it is that the attackers were able to guess over 100,000 times a day for over a year. I think it took 13, 14 months. But eventually they guessed the Welcome 2020. If you look, it kind of fits the complexity rules I talked about. It starts with an uppercase consonant followed by a lowercase vowel, A, E, I, O, or U. And if there's a number, it's a 1 or a 2 at the end. Well, the year 2020 or 2021 or 2022, that's actually another common thing that hackers will guess all the time. A lot of people like to change their password, and they'll just change the year at the end, and hackers know that. But this is the longest password that I know that in real life. I'm sure there have been longer ones, but the longest one I know about is this 10-character Welcome 2020. That was guessed. And you go, oh, that's great, Roger. I'll just use an 11-character password to stop somebody from guessing it. But that's not enough. And we'll talk about why as I continue on. And again, attackers have to guess. They have to be able to guess a password. They have to have an accessible logon prompt somewhere in the company, that's internet accessible. Usually, a lot of times we'll try Gmail or Office 365 or Cisco VPN connection or something like that. There's many password guessing tools out there. There's literally probably got to be 100 of them. Here are some of the ones I've used over the years: Brutus, WebBrute, Cain and Abel. The bottom one is called Hydra or Hydra THC. That's the one that most hackers use today. It's a command line tool, but it also has a GUI that you can put on it. It's very fast and efficient and can try. You kind of tell it again, what type of password you're guessing at. Is it a web server password or, Telnet password or Cisco VPN password and that sort of stuff. And then you upload a password dictionary and it will start cracking as fast as its little heart can. A more popular attack type today is called credential stuffing or password spray attacks. The conventional password guessing is I have, let's say, Roger's account, and I'm going to guess 1,000,000 passwords against Roger's account. Well, those types of password guessing attacks, they're still popular, but because most logons are now limited to, 3, 4, 6 guesses before it will lock out the account, attackers are turning to these password credential stuffing spray attacks. And what they do here is they guess with less passwords, say 1,000 passwords, but they do it against all the user accounts. Remember I said 75% of companies will have at least one user on a list of 1,000 most common passwords. So they'll get a list, they'll get a login prompt, they'll get all the employee login names, which are usually just the employee email addresses, and then they'll guess slowly, and they'll do it slow enough that it doesn't set off account lockout. Acme, one of the world's largest internet companies, or at least they probably are able to see a lot more of the internet than a lot of other companies. They have load balancing servers and things like that. They said they saw 61 billion credential stuffing attacks in 18 months. In a year and a half, one company saw 61 billion credential stuffing attacks. These credential stuffing attacks are oftentimes very successfully getting in companies large and small. Like there's a readout there. There's a news story where the FBI told Citrix that hackers likely got in using a technique called password spraying. Both Microsoft and Google have said that password spraying attacks constitute one of the most viable threats against their customers. And again, as Microsoft has told you, 1 out of every 250 of their customer accounts has been compromised by a hacker in some way, many times using password spray attacks. A lot of times the attackers like to guess against application programming interfaces. Not every company has an application programming interface, but if you do, that's usually an application programming interface typically meant for a programming thing to be able to do large amounts of connections or queries or something. A lot of times, though, these application programming interfaces allow people to try to authenticate, something which hackers love, and they rarely have account lockout enabled. They usually, MFA usually can't be used. And so they're often used, application programming interfaces, if they exist for your company, are often used by hackers to do password guessing and password spray attacks. Acme, they're the company that said there is over 61 billion password spray attacks in the last 18 months. They said 75% of those were against APIs. So if your company has APIs, make sure you protect them and monitor them and enable account lockout on them. Password spray attacks use different types of password guessing tools. The most common one is known, or one of the most common ones is known as Spray or Spray Master. It's just a shell script that anybody can download. It's a free download. People can go to GitHub and download it today. But essentially, you just tell it, hey, Spray shell script, I want to do guessing on, in this example, Cisco, and here's the login address, or here's the URL of the server's login page, then the file name of the username list, the file name of the password dictionary you want to use, and then how many guesses you can do in a certain amount of minutes without locking out the account. And then you set it off, and this account, or this tool, shell spray script, will just sit there guessing, again, as many different usernames as they can, but not faster than they can, guess at. It doesn't end up enabling or making the account lockout get enabled. A newer tool that's been out the last couple of years is called CredMaster. It uses a Python script instead of a shell script, but it essentially does the same thing. The big benefit, and the reason why this is becoming more popular, why CredMaster is becoming more popular than the shell spray script, is that it uses Amazon APIs, and so the password guessing, password spray attacks actually appear as if they're coming from different IP addresses. Some of the logon account lockouts will stop, like after 250 guesses from a single IP address, will lock it. But if you do it from different IP addresses, it will let you do thousands of guesses. So CredMaster is kind of becoming the go-to password spray attack tool of choice because it can, appear. It works using Amazon AWS and can appear as if coming from different IP addresses, which can be very helpful to the attacker. Password guessing attacks, sometimes they don't even have to guess. There are literally thousands of hard-coded default passwords in devices and firmware and software, and all you have to do is go to any Google or any internet search browser search screen and type in well-known default password, and you will get dozens to hundreds of lists that will list all the well-known default passwords, because many people never change the well-known default passwords of the software and hardware they use. Some of them are hard-coded by the manufacturer and can't be changed. This, it's always a developer problem. Developers should always make everybody's default password be different. And usually, these days when they do that, they usually include the default password on a sticker or something like that. But there are still all these hard-coded default passwords out there. And again, many times you can't change it. And so if somebody finds that device or that software in your system, they can try the default password and break on in. It just happens. So what are your defenses against password guessing? Change any default passwords immediately. Use strong passwords. Again, that really means 12-character fully random or 20 characters if out of your head. Make sure enable count lockout policies, even on APIs. And, of course, enable failed login monitoring and alerting. And it's always good to use phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication where you can, because wherever you're using that, they're not stealing your password. Password hash cracking is another type of password guessing. Password guessing is an attacker guessing against an online prompt where they put a login name and a password and they hit enter and they have to wait to see whether they're successful. Password hash cracking is guessing, but it's a different type of guessing. In this case, the hacker is somehow able to get your password hash. All of today's popular operating systems store your password as hashes instead. And then if they get those password hashes, they can then take them into a password hash cracking tool or rig. We'll talk more about that. That will try to guess at that hash, which theoretically is unbreakable. But it turns out if they upload a really big password dictionary and they try trillions of guesses a second, they can usually very quickly break most people's passwords. And I'll give you an example again of how that's done, and I'll even show you a demo in a minute of how it's done. But most of today's popular operating systems, when you type in your plain text password the first time, let me say that maybe it's frog, the operating system will immediately convert it to a cryptographic hash. And what hash algorithm they use depends on the operating system, the version of the operating system. Windows used to store passwords. It was called the LM LAN manager hash. Today, they store it as the NT hash. So if I type in frog in Windows, it actually stores the NT hash alone. If you're logging in locally, it will store it in what's called the local SAM Security Accounts Manager database. If you're logging in on an Active Directory network, it stores the NT hash of your password in a file called ntds.dit on the domain controllers of that within that domain. If you have Macs or Linux, they used to store your password as a SHA-1 hash. Now they store it as a SHA-2 256-bit hash. If you have a really secure operating system like OpenBSD, it will store it as a bcrypt hash. Bcrypt is among the two strongest hashes you could possibly have. NT hash is considered about medium security. And everybody wishes Microsoft would start to use something else like SHA-2 or bcrypt or PBDFK, and Microsoft does use some stronger hashes in some places, but for backwards compatibility, Microsoft still uses the NT hash and will still recognize the LM hash if you go out of your way to re-enable it. But whenever, if an attacker can get your password hashes, they can then upload those hashes into a password hash cracking tool. On your screen, I have one called OptCrack. It's really, it's not the most popular password hash cracking tool. I just have it here because it's a Windows GUI and it looks really pretty. But the hacker, again, could download your stolen hashes, and then they would upload their password dictionary and then tell it to guess as fast as it can. And the password dictionary has these pre-computed hashes. And then so they can compare hash against hash against hash. When two hashes meet, then they know they have the correct password. So for an example there, Trisha and Kathy L., their passwords are guessed because their password hashes represented flower and password. So that's pretty common. Today, most hackers use something called Hashcat, which is a lot faster than OptCrack. But the big thing is the hacker has to have your hashes in the first place. And traditionally, the attacker had to be have a very elevated account to steal your hashes. They had to be local administrator on your Windows system, or root if you're in a Linux Mac system, or they had to be, domain administrator if they're an Active Directory domain controller or something. Traditionally, it takes a lot of access to steal your password hash, but there are a few attacks that don't require this elevated access, and I'm going to show you two of them right now. And it's because of this, because your password hashes can be stolen without the attacker having to be on your system with an elevated account, that I recommend that your passwords be 12 characters fully random or 20 characters or longer if out of your head. And it's because of these special cases that, again, the attacker doesn't need elevated access to get your hashes. Sometimes passwords are transmitted in plain text across the network. That's always bad. But in the Windows world, there's another thing, these other two tricks called, Microsoft Windows itself doesn't typically transmits passwords in plain text across the network. But these other two tricks, known as Kerberoasting and this email password hash theft trick, I'm going to show you a demo of that latter one in just a second. But those latter two attacks, this email password hash theft attack and Kerberos roasting attack, they allow on Windows systems, sometimes non-Windows systems, for your password hash to be acquired without the attacker being elevated or on your system. Kerberos roasting requires that an attacker get on a Windows system, typically a networked Windows system, so it's in Active Directory. But it turns out that any attacker, if they break into a Windows system connected to an Active Directory network, they can, in the context of the regular user, get the NT hashes from any Windows account with what's called a Kerberos service principal name. Those accounts, the ones that have their Kerberos accounts and they have what's called a service principal name, SPN, they tend to be highly privileged accounts in most people's environments. It tends to be your backup accounts, your antivirus accounts, your patch management accounts, your antivirus accounts. And so once an attacker gets that hash and cracks it, they're usually getting the keys to the kingdom. It is the most, they're typically the most privileged accounts in the network. And so I got to tell you, Kerberos roasting was revealed probably 10 years ago, maybe longer. But the fact that Microsoft doesn't fix this and prevent it from happening, it must be very difficult to prevent, because they would have fixed it already if they could. It must break too many things if they try to stop this attack. But it just means that if an attacker gets on your Windows system, even if they're in as a regular user, they can get your hashes. They can get hashes to the most privileged. Not every account has a Kerberos service principal name, but the most authoritative ones in your environment typically do. This is why you have to have a 12-character fully random or 20-character long, because there are attackers, there's ransomware gangs and penetration and hackers today that use Kerberos roasting to compromise your passwords. I have friends that compromise passwords up to 18 characters long all the time using this trick. It is a real-world thing, and as long as this is true, that this can happen, I'm going to recommend that everybody have long and complex passwords. But it's even worse, because at least that one, the Kerberos roasting, the attacker had to be on your system. With this phishing password hash theft trick, I can send you an email, and then all you do is open the email. And most of the time I have to trick you into clicking on a link. But this is phishing. It's not that hard to make people click on a link. We know from our own data that the average company, about a third of their employees will click on any link until they've been trained not to do it. But if I can trick you into clicking on a link, I can get your computer, especially if it's a Windows computer, but it happens with Mac and Linux machines as well, can be tricked into connecting to a server on the internet. That server, the hacker server, then tells your browser, your email client, hey, you need to authenticate to log on here to download this object. And your browser or your email client would do what's called a challenge response authentication, where it doesn't share your password. It doesn't even share your password hash, but the challenge response shares enough information that the hacking tool can get your password hash that can be cracked. So let me say this again. I can send you a phishing email, and if I trick you into clicking on a link, I can get your password hash. I'm going to show you a demo that Kevin Mitnick did. He's using a trick called the file:// trick. All he does is put a link in the phishing email with file:// in it, and then it points to a server out on the internet. If you want more details how this is done, You can read my blog article on it or my CSO Online magazine about this in more details. But I want to show you the demo. It's pretty cool to see if you've never seen it before. It's a quick demo, about a minute and 20 seconds. Let me shut up and let you see the demo.
This is the attacker system in the cloud, in the Amazon cloud in Virginia. And we have, I'm logged into Outlook 365 here. I'm simply just going to click on the email. I just clicked. It takes a second for Office 365 to load. And here we go. We could see that the email's from Roger Grimes at nsa.gov, which is quite interesting. And there's nothing there. There's no hyperlink to click on. There's no attachment. But if we go over to the attacker system over here in the cloud, we were able to intercept or obtain the victim's NTLM v2 hash. So let's go ahead and try to do this. So we're going to go ahead and highlight this. We're going to copy it. We're going to go over to our password cracker over here. We're going to create a file. Here we go. We're going to paste in the hash. Very simple. And then what I'm going to do is just run a shell script that tries to crack the hash through a dictionary attack. And this is using a tool called local hashcat. And guess what? It's already cracked the hash. So if we scroll up here, we see there was a user named Kevin, right? And the password to the hash is Kevin123.
So pretty wild if you've never seen that before. A lot of people say, well, how can I stop this attack? Oh my God, how do I stop it? You can filter any inbound link that has file : / in it. If you have a Microsoft Windows computer, you can actually apply this optional patch. Microsoft made this optional patch that you can apply to Windows systems. It requires some registry configuration. It's optional though, so I've never been on anybody's computer that's ever had it. And you can, of course, have passwords that have enough complexity and what we call entropy to withstand cracking attempts. And again, that's 12 characters, fully random and longer. Or if it comes out of your head, it has to be 20 characters or longer. And you can also do firewall port blocking. There's a list of the ports that you could block on any computer. These are ports that shouldn't be allowed to go out on the internet anyways. And if you block them, it will stop the known types of attacks like this. But it all comes down to that the attackers get your hashes, however they get them, and then it's really how quickly can they, be guessed at or cracked. Really, the answer today is tens of trillions of times a second. It really depends on the type of hashes, about how fast they can crack. NT hashes tend to be about medium complexity to crack. The SHA-1, SHA-2 or harder. The PBKDF2, you've heard me say that once before. That's actually used in some Windows hashes, but just not in the Windows login hashes. They use NT. That's hard. And bcrypt, which I told you is used with like OpenBSD, those are the hardest ones to crack. But today, attackers, password hash crackers, guessers use what's called graphical processing units. So it used to be you'd buy a graphical processing unit to play games and have really good graphics. These days, they're used to do Bitcoin mining, cryptocurrency mining, and to do password hash cracking. You can buy these password hash cracking rigs for a couple $1,000 to $25,000, $30,000, and $40,000 that literally have hundreds of these GPUs. You can even buy them in cloud computing, but people will say, how fast can password hashes be cracked? And this is referring to NT hashes. Many people have the capability in a single PC to do 2 trillion guesses per second. If an attacker is able to guess at your password 2 trillion times a second, how long do you think it will take to crack your password? I can tell you this, the average person's password is cracked in less than 8 hours. But there are some elite top rigs that can guess at tens of trillions of times a second. And we think that nation states probably have hundreds of trillions of guesses per second, and hundreds of trillions of guesses per second against your hash can be bought for $50 to $100 in the cloud. So you have to assume that attackers can easily guess at, dozens of trillions of times a second to hundreds of trillions of times a second at your password. And we know that a password hash cracking rig that can guess 45 trillion times per second, it just starts to get very difficult in NT hash at around 11, 12 characters. If it's perfectly random, if you made it out of your head, they're guessing it in seconds or minutes or under 8 hours. But if you have a perfectly random 12-character password, NT hash protected, it would take an attacker with 45 trillion guesses per second, 538 years to crack it. So we're guessing if they have hundreds of trillions of guesses per second that your password would still make it, 5, 10, 15 years and what would be relevant. And if you have a SHA-2 hash like with Max or Linux or something like that, or bcrypt, you probably still would need a password at least 10, 11 characters, but you wouldn't necessarily need 12 characters. In the Windows world, you need 12-character perfectly random passwords. So remember this. In order to protect your password from password hash cracking, it needs to be perfectly random and 12 characters long. If it comes out of your head, it needs to be 20 characters or longer. Let me say again, I have friends that routinely guess from stolen, or they're paid to do it legally, legit. They're legally allowed to guess at NT password hashes. They are cracking passwords routinely, daily, up to 18 characters long. But that's why you should use MFA wherever you can, so they can't crack your password hash, or a password manager, because it makes fully random passwords. And also remember that a stolen hash on a Windows system, especially in Active Directory, can be reused without cracking the password. There are tools like Mimikatz and Wince and things like that, where if I have your hash, I can just log into any machine that your password would otherwise work on. So you should just remember that if the hacker gets your hashes, it could be game over anyways without even having to crack them. But at least if all they can get is your hashes, they usually want to get back to your plain text password, because it allows them to log in more places. And if we don't have them, then it will frustrate the hackers. But you really, to the best of your ability, should try to prevent hackers from getting your hashes in the first place. Again, if they get your hashes, it may be game over, because they can just reuse them, especially on Windows and Active Directory networks. But if you have long, complex passwords, that will help stop the successful cracking as best they can. Sometimes attackers, they don't care what your password is. They'll just reset it. They'll tell the software that you're dealing with, like Facebook or Twitter or Office 365 or whatever, I lost my password. And sometimes the different services allow different recovery modes, like Microsoft and other services many times will send the recovery code that you can use to an alternate email address. A lot of times hackers have compromised your alternative email example, or you forget your password to get into your alternate email. But those are one way that it's sent. A lot of times they'll send them to you in SMS. Here's your SMS reset code. Unfortunately, hackers can trick you into revealing your SMS password reset code. So, that's not a good thing. Sometimes your password is going to be reset with password reset questions, or what's officially known as knowledge-based questions, like what's your mother's maiden name? What's your favorite car? Those are terrible, because whatever your password is, it's going to take more guesses to guess your real password than to guess your mother's maiden name. Anybody can look that up on a genealogy website. If there's only, what's your favorite car? There's only like 100 car models in the entire world, right? I mean, it just won't take that many. And most people's favorite car is probably, I could probably cut off 80 of those cars that no one either knows about or thinks about or wants as their favorite car, like a Ford Escort or something like that. Password reset questions are just the worst recovery in the method on the planet. Google actually had a white paper years ago called Secret Lies and Account Recovery Lessons from the Use of Personal Knowledge Questions at Google. They said 20% of people's recovery questions can be guessed on the first try by a hacker. 1/6, one out of every 6 answers can be found in a person's social media profile, and 40% of people were unable to successfully recall their own recovery answers. What that all means is that you should use password reset questions if you can avoid them. Unfortunately, there are many services that still require that you put in password questions and answers. What I recommend is you do not put in the real answer. This is not Jeopardy. You don't have to put in the real answer. Don't put in your real mother's maiden name. Put in frog, dog, pizza 32, whatever. And that's what I do. I don't answer them honestly. But the bad thing is it means I have to put in the question and my fake answer for every website that asks for this sort of stuff. I put in my password manager. You can put it in a password protected Word document or whatever. But the bad thing is I have to write them down. But if you put in the real answers to your password reset questions, you're just asking to be hacked. And then sometimes you just ask people for it. I've often walked up to people in a company and said, my name's Roger Grimes. I'm with, Microsoft or KnowBe4 or Foundstone. I'm here to do password penetration testing auditing. What's your password? And every time I've ever asked that, what's your password? They have told me what their password is. I've also been in studies where we stood on the street and we offered people a chocolate bar or a pen for their, or a $2 fountain pen for their password, and they gave us their passwords. Sometimes you just got to ask people what their password is. They'll tell you. If you don't believe this, I don't have time to show you this, but go watch a Jimmy Kimmel password video. Follow that link. And this is just somebody randomly on the street in Hollywood, downtown Hollywood, asking people that walk by, what is your password? And there are like 10 people on that video that just tell this stranger filming them on camera what their password is. If you don't believe that people would give you your password if you ask, you just haven't done it enough. So from that, what are my password recommendations? And again, password policy recommendations are, they include length and complexity and how long the password should be good for and all sort of stuff. And there's a lot of other rules that go along with password policy, like how often should you change it? Should you enable account lockout? Yes. And also, don't allow them to use old passwords they just use, and it shouldn't be common passwords like password, and it shouldn't be the same as their login name. There's a lot of rules, but what most people want to know is how long and complex does it need to be? But don't forget, you must protect all involved components, because if you allow the hacker to get to your password system, then it's all games over anyways. But here's my password policy once again. You should use phishing-resistant MFA wherever you can to protect valuable things. Where you can't, you need to use long and complex passwords. And I know there's other people that recommend other things, but because of the reasons I just told you, because of Kerberos roasting and email password hash theft tricks, those other people are wrong and I'm right. So make sure if you use passwords, they have to be different for every website and service you use. They should be 12 characters, perfectly random or longer, or 20 characters or longer if they come out of your head. So a passphrase like Roger jumped over the purple fox or something like that. You can create less long and less complex passwords, but they will be susceptible to password hash guessing and cracking. Again, I have friends that are cracking 18-character passwords all the time, every day, for a living. So this is what I think you should use. MFA, phishing-resistant MFA wherever you can, and then either a 12-character perfectly random password or longer, or 20 characters or longer passphrase if it comes out of your head. That's if you want it to be not susceptible to known password guessing and cracking attacks. If you're not as worried about those sort of attacks, you can go for something shorter. But let me say again, most password attacks out of the types we've talked about, they don't care what your password is. If I steal it from you, if I socially engineer it from you, if I compromise a website that has your password, they don't care how long your password is. You can have a really long password, but if I steal it from you or I crack it out of a website or something, it's just game over. The only types of attacks that password length and complexity care about is this password guessing and password hash cracking. But the vast majority of attacks don't care how long or complex your password is. If you do care about these other types of password attacks, password guessing or password hash cracking, then you want to have longer, more complex passwords. And password complexity is really known as entropy, which is how random something is. Human-created passwords don't have a lot of entropy. And truly random passwords, which look like gobbledygook, are really hard for humans to make and remember. These examples here are what most people think might be a complex password. Roger is a goon, and I do an uppercase somewhere, and I put an O in there or a 0 in there instead of an O, or Roger Grimes 3 or something like that. This is what truly random high-entropy passwords look like. These are the type of passwords that password managers make, and this is why we recommend that you should use a password manager instead. So, to have a truly complex password, to have true perfect randomness with high entropy, it really takes a password creator or a password manager to do it. The average human-generated complex password, again, was an uppercase first letter, lowercase second letter, and a 1 or 2 at the end or something like that. Like, these are the types of passwords that most people think are complex. They are not complex. They really aren't. They're harder to guess, but not that hard to crack when you can guess at 45 trillion times a second. If you want to see how strong your password is, you can go to these different websites here and put in what your password is. Although I would say change up your password a little bit. You don't want to be giving a complete stranger your actual password. But you can see, like if I put in what's considered a regular complex password like Roger G. Gry 2, it would only take 3 days to crack it. The reality is today we would break that in minutes. But you can see the ones that are truly random really take, 41 trillion years, or Roger jumped over the dog and cat. That one's not complex at all. It's just a passphrase, but very hard to guess. I'm a big believer in password managers. I think everybody should use it because they create, use, and store truly random passwords. They allow you to create, store, and easy use of long and complex passwords. They have a lot of other cool features. A lot of people ask me, what password manager do you like? I say check out the Wired magazine at wired.com article. They have 2 password manager review articles there. There's the link for one of them. And let me just say, I like the Wired magazine articles, comments on which password manager they like. They're pretty cool password managers. Like here's a password manager example where it's saying, hey, your password's vulnerable. Literally, if one of the websites you belong to gets compromised, some of the password managers will proactively tell you, hey, your website got compromised. You need to choose a new password. That's pretty cool. There are some negatives on password managers, including you've got to learn how to use them, and they don't work with every website and device and browser. And I could say it takes the average person a couple of days to get used to using, but once you start using them, they really, really are great to use. I think everybody should use a password manager. And if you're worried about the single point of failure, that is a risk, but I think the risk that a password manager offsets is better than worrying about a single point of failure. Also, you should use multi-factor authentication where you can. A hacker can't steal your password if you're not using a password. Although, just keep in mind that you should use phishing-resistant MFA. Most MFA is not phishing-resistant. Most MFA is easily phishable, and I don't recommend that you use it. I actually have a list called My List of Good Strong MFA, and it lists every MFA solution that is phishing resistant. Good thing to look at. No matter what type of MFA you have, whether it's phishing resistant or easily phishable, you should teach the people using it that these are the common types of attacks against your type of MFA solution. Here's how you recognize these attacks. Here's how you put down these attacks, and here's how you report the attacks to your organization so somebody knows about them. You wouldn't tell people how to use passwords without giving them some education. Make sure if you give them MFA that you train users in the common types of attacks against their type of MFA, how to detect it, how to mitigate it, and how to report it. Also, if you're interested in more information on multi-factor authentication, we have a free ebook called the 12 Ways to Hack Multi-Factor Authentication. And we have a multi-factor authentication security assessment tool that will tell you all the ways that I can hack the solution that you like the most. Also, you of course, should enable monitoring and alerting of bad logins. Once the threshold of an abnormal number of failed logins in a given time period has been exceeded, it should be reported and investigated so someone looks it up and doesn't just ignore it. There's other checks you should do, like removing accounts that you no longer need, making sure that people aren't using common passwords, making sure that they're not using passwords out on the internet that they also use at your company. Have lots of good information on that. At KnowBe4 in general, we really do believe that everybody should be appropriately trained in cybersecurity. They should have a longer training when they're hired that lasts, 15, 30, 45 minutes, an hour when they're hired, and then once a year thereafter. And then every month, everybody should get some smaller training, 1, 2, 3 minutes of training. And you should at least monthly do simulated phishing tests to see how well people took in the training. If they failed the simulated phishing test, they should be giving more training and more simulated phishing tests so that everybody gets trained on what not to click. Our average customer that comes to us has somewhere around 30% of their employees will click on any phishing email. And after they've been trained within a year, it goes down to below somewhere around 5%, sometimes lower, especially if you do that, annual and monthly training in simulated phishing. This works. This is not our best customers. This is our average customers, significantly reducing the risk. With that said, thanks for putting up with me for the last hour. My name's Roger Grimes. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me at rogerg@knowbe4.com, rogerg@knowbe4.com, and also follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I write about MFA and passwords like literally every week. Thanks a lot for putting up with me, and fight the good fight.